Well, thank you very much for bringing that very important subject of our beloved country of Zimbabwe. Let me start by saying Zimbabwe is a very special country. Special country in the sense that when you look at our history and how we attained our independence, it was independence that was attained through blood loss of thousands of young people who stood up after being oppressed, after living under apartheid conditions for a very long time, starting with colonization, followed by the unilateral declaration of independence by Ian Smith, which of course ushered in the apartheid. With that background, it is pretty clear that any leadership that's going to be in Zimbabwe has got to recognize how Zimbabwe got to be the Zimbabwe that we have today. I think it's actually true for most of the African nations that attained their independence through guerrilla warfare, through bloodshed, through loss of lives of many young people. That having been said, you will find that since independence, there have been forces, outside forces, that were very disappointed that Zimbabwe was not thrown into a civil war after our independence. You saw the coming together of President Mugabe and then Vice President Joshua Nkomo. Again, a negotiated agreement from two leaders who had fought viciously to liberate our people. That background, that history of liberation, the history that we must never ever forget, those who lost their lives defending Zimbabwe. So it is fitting that if we are going to have a leader, we must have a leader who respects that. We must have a leader who understands that for us to have the independence that we have today in Zimbabwe, many people lost their lives. There are still forces that are still trying to make sure that Zimbabwe continues to pay for having had a transition to civilian rule that was not marred with a civil war. Some of you may not know, but there are many forces that wanted Zimbabwe to get into a civil war. That did not happen. Following that, there was the land reform, which people again must understand. The Lancaster Agreement, what it stipulated, what needed to happen, when Zimbabwe would begin to talk about the land reform. It is Zimbabwe that followed the Lancaster Agreement to the T. People don't know that history. It is Britain, it is the white Zimbabweans who did not follow the Lancaster Agreement to the T. It is those who wanted to make sure that white rule continued in Zimbabwe that started creating chaos, that started using their own connections outside to make sure that negative information is shown on Zimbabwe repeatedly. Consequently, because of the land reform, Zimbabwe has endured 23 years of sanctions. And in spite of all that, sanctions that everybody has said are unfounded, sanctions that everybody has said they are illegal, but nonetheless, the sanctions continue because those with outside connections continue to exert pressure and spew out negative information about the country. With that in mind, when you look at if we are going to have an opposition, former president, Vice President Tsvangirai, after having gone through some contentious periods with President Mugabe, they eventually had gotten to where they had a common understanding. A common understanding, for example, that when Vice President Tsvangirai was getting married, his reception was being hosted by President Mugabe. That's the sort of Zimbabwe we want to see, where leadership understands that, yes, we may fight, yes, we may have our disagreements, but at the end of the day, we must ultimately look at what is ultimately best for the people. We don't want leadership that's going to be used by outside forces as instruments of our own self-destruction. I'm leading this to say, during my tenure as the African Union ambassador to the United States, I was quite disappointed by members of the then MDC, and that included Chamisa, the current president of CCC, which is a new party, when they were coming to the United States to lobby for sanctions against Zimbabwe to continue. That to me was quite disturbing, understanding what sanctions were doing to the average person on the street, why then would anyone who wants to lead the people of Zimbabwe, why then would anyone who claims to love the people of Zimbabwe then come to Washington and lobby for sanctions against Zimbabwe to continue? I think it was at that point that the opposition of Zimbabwe lost me. I just could not understand it. And that sentiment continues. You hear comments from some of them claiming that the Westerners are going to help us, that we needed to bring Westerners in order to improve the economy. They fail to understand that the economy is where it is today because of the same Western countries that are not pleased to see Zimbabwe moving forward. The same Western forces that are more interested in our natural resources, the same Western forces that are doing the same in many other countries. What I would like our African electorates to understand, that you can analyze any African country. It doesn't matter how good a government is. The outsiders, particularly the Western countries, will always support the opposition. Wherein lies the problem, because now we are being used as instruments of our own self-destruction. Our people should stop and pay attention to what is really going on. That is my problem with what is happening in Zimbabwe. Some in the opposition are heavily funded and supported by outside forces. So needless to say, their judgment is flawed. Their judgment is not based on what is ultimately best for the people of Zimbabwe. For me, the opposition lobbying for sanctions to continue against Zimbabwe, that was the red line that they crossed for me, and that's when they lost me as a Zimbabwean. And so the opposition, I feel they need to understand our history, and they need to understand that they cannot be supported by outside forces, and that they should resist the temptation to be used as instrument of our own self-destruction. We have our elders. I understand President Kikwete is leading a team that's going to be going to Zimbabwe. There are processes that we can follow. There are V11 forms that are available. They are free to review them. They have the right to contest the elections. They have the right to ask as many questions as they want. They have the right, even in the United States, you remember back then when they talked about counting the charts. Whatever needs to be done to count those votes, to count those V11 forms, but do it truthfully, without cheating, without creating unnecessary wahala, like we would say in Nigeria. But there is due process that they should be awarded. They are free to recount the elections. And yes, people must be free to cast their votes without intimidation. Yes. My own understanding is that about 2 to 5% of the votes, there were some challenges there. That is to be expected. But even then, that 2 to 5% of votes that were felt to be not quite at par, they need to be evaluated. Right. But when you look at the greater scheme of things, I think 2 to 5% of the votes having some issues is not too big a number. But nonetheless, those two must be counted. But at the end of the day, I feel our elders should be allowed to deal with the situation in Zimbabwe and any other country that has issues, and keep the outsiders out of the situation, because their intentions are never good. In fact, it is they that create unnecessary conditions in our countries.